That is.
And of course, one of the critical elements in this whole economic meltdown over the last few years has been the Federal Reserve's involvement. Under orders from Congress, the Fed released details of the emergency loans it made in response to that 2008 financial crisis. What did we learn, John Dickerson?
Well, we learned there were 21,000 loan records released, and we learned that the loans went out to a whole lot more people than you might have otherwise guessed, including foreign banks, corporations, and one of the things that was striking about this incredible emergency behavior is that in some cases, to keep the financial system afloat, which was their goal, they relied on collateral from Citigroup, for example, that was quite risky. I mean, it was, letting these loans, letting Citigroup borrow the money, and the assets that carried the greatest risks of default were what were backing up those loans, which is the kind of risks people were taking that led to the disaster in the first place. Now, the Fed said we had to do this. We were the lender of last resort. We had to rush in pell-mell and try to save the banking system. But I think as a political matter, save not just the banking system, the entire economic system, as a political matter, when you see these extraordinary measures taken to rush in and save these corporations, people wonder, they say, well, what building do I go visit in Washington where people are rushing around, diving in front of disasters in order to protect the middle class? And they don't see such a building.
Right, and at the same time, this comes as the Fed is fighting another battle over its decision to pump $600 billion into the economy. We saw during the president's recent trip to Asia how controversial that decision is, and it's sparked a lot of debate in Congress about how much oversight Congress should have. I'm struck by, in a way, the politicization of the Fed. It used to be that when the Fed spoke, it was like, it was like the Supreme Court before Bush v. Gore, right? These were institutions in our society that were revered and that were somehow free of politics. And now, like the court, which since Bush v. Gore has been caught up in the political debate, we're seeing the Fed really caught up in a political debate over its own future.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that that the two people perhaps that are most behind pushing reform at the Fed are Bernie Sanders, who is a self-avowed socialist senator from Vermont, and Ron Paul, who's a very much libertarian Republican from Texas. And I think that speaks to a strain of suspicion of the Fed that's very prevalent in the left and the right, and something that's caught on a little more broadly as the economic system has struggled. And I think what we're seeing with these revelations, in addition to what they actually show, is the manifestation of this broad suspicion of the Fed that's only grown in the past couple of years.
And $1 trillion we're talking about.
I mean, it's $1 trillion, and also the institutions again are just these names that are that represent colossal interests, and just as a political matter, again, when people look at this, they see huge numbers, big corporations, and the argument that these corporations have to exist because the whole economic system needs to be protected. You can make that argument to somebody, but it requires you got to sit down and have a bit of a conversation. And as a political matter, what they see is a lot of effort being done by people they never elected with their money. Well, not in this case with their money, but that they have no control over, that there's just nobody watching the shop here.
So we're talking about firms like GE, Harley-Davidson, central banks in Britain, Japan. We're talking about Mexico, South Korea, Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland that the Fed put money out to. I don't get it.
Yeah, that's always a subject of great, people get very concerned about that. I mean, I think the argument that the Fed would make, and that its supporters do make, is that we essentially need to help prop up the world's economic system because we're at the crux of it and the core of it. We suffer when it suffers, and when we struggle, it struggles. And but that doesn't mean that it's something that people tend to accept. One of the arguments that Bernie Sanders makes is also, look, what did we as a country get from this gift, this aid that it's if you want to give people a lot of money, fine, but make them help small businesses, make them help, homeowners. Instead, they get all this help. Now they're doing great. They're bouncing along. They're making profits. They're doing fine, while ordinary Americans are struggling. So this thing has a very strong populist element to it.
And just one other is that they get the money was paid back. The Fed would say we got a return on the money, but Bernie Sanders' point is that isn't enough. That there's got to be some economic activity here that actually helps other
All right.
people.
To Mark.